Next, item 9, City of Sanibel Surface Water Management Plan, presented by Jordan Varble of Johnson Engineering on behalf of the City of Sanibel.
Can I just say a couple words before Jordan starts? So this is not the city's first stormwater management plan or surface water management plan update. It's just our most recent one. Our last update we did around 2017. It was never formally adopted by City Council because Hurricane Irma railroaded our effort at that point, and our duties kind of got redirected. But this one's a little bit different because it is the first time we're assessing our stormwater on Sanibel in the face of major storm events, surge events, and sea level rise. And I just also want to thank Johnson Engineering for coming out today. So.
Sorry, just before you get going, I was remiss in my duties. The purpose of this is to share with the committee how the City of Sanibel is updating the Surface Water Management Master Plan to reflect the current conditions of the stormwater management system following Hurricane Ian. This relates to water quality improvement priority action 3, reducing urban stormwater and agricultural runoff pollution.
And you can just call me next slide and I'll advance it for you if you want to stand.
Do you want to stand there?
Okay. Instead of it.
Oh, yeah, you're gonna go over there to see it.
Again, I'm Jordan Varble with Johnson Engineering, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak today on our updated city's master plan for the surface water management. Yeah. Actually, the most of the work was done by Gabby Santucci, so I've asked her to do the presentation today. But so anyways, go ahead, Gabby.
Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm an intern at Johnson Engineering, studying civil engineering at University of Virginia, but I'm from Fort Myers, so I'm home for the summer. Yeah, today we're going to talk about the update to Sanibel's surface water master plan. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start out with just an introduction to Sanibel and hydrology. Then we'll talk about some of the damage repairs briefly post Ian. And then talk about different kinds of flooding, how Sanibel is vulnerable to them. And the main thing we'll talk about is the data collection section, which is we're going to talk about vegetation health, evapotranspiration, water levels. And we'll cap it off talking about sea level rise and Sanibel's resiliency looking to the future. Next slide, please. Right, so everyone is probably familiar with Sanibel. Low-lying barrier islands down in Lee County, about 12 miles long. Average elevation is only about 4 feet above sea level, so it's pretty low. It has a valuable interior wetlands ecosystem, and they're freshwater. So one of the important parts in water management is trying to keep the wetlands freshwater. And since Sanibel became a city, there's been a big emphasis on environmental preservation. So a significant portion of the interior areas are just wetlands preserves. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay. And so on the left, there's a topographic map of Sanibel. Everything in dark blue is below 2 feet NAVD. So really the elevated areas are just the developed ones. And because of this, the island kind of acts like a bowl. So the rim is the roadways. We have an east basin and a west basin divided by roads again. Each basin has a weir that outfalls to Pine Island Sound. And so when it rains, if it rains enough, then you get runoff over the weirs. Otherwise, it just fills up. And it's important to try and maintain that freshwater. That's why they have the weirs, to prevent saltwater intrusion into the wetlands. Okay. Next slide, please. Thanks. And then again, everyone's familiar with the damages from Hurricane Ian. We mostly focused on the damages to stormwater infrastructure. So a lot of inlets and culverts were buried and some of the swales were filled in. So part of our job was to find these. I'll talk about that. Next slide, please. Okay, so we went out and mapped a lot of the secondary infrastructure. Sanibel already had GIS maps showing where culverts and inlets, things like that were, but we got more detailed and did all the driveway culverts, things like that, inspected them, found which ones need to be cleaned. Right now, there's a contractor out there cleaning out culverts and things like that. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, another big component, I guess, or another component of the plan was there's public education involved. So there was a public workshop held with city residents a few months ago, March, yeah, in March. And we made these posters to show the public. And so we talked about different kinds of flooding for residents who may not have thought about that a whole lot. So the first kind would be riverine flooding, rainfall based, not storm surge. And what we found is that Sanibel's stormwater infrastructure works pretty well and responds well to rainfall. Next slide, please. Thanks. And then contrasting that with storm surge. And again, everyone knows what storm surge is, but on the left there, we have a map. It's an inundation map of Sanibel during the 100-year flood event from FEMA, and the entire island is inundated because it's a surge event. So clearly, Sanibel is pretty vulnerable to that. And there's not a whole lot that can be done, but it's important for residents to be able to understand what flooding is avoidable, what isn't, things like that. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, and so a pretty common question from residents is, my home hasn't ever flooded before. Why is it flooding now? And the simple reason for that is because we've seen a high concentration of extreme water levels in just the past few years. And of course, there is sea level rise occurring, as shown by the bottom line, which is annual mean sea level. And then the blue triangles are annual maximum sea level. And so clearly the extreme water levels are kind of increasing, not necessarily independently of, but in excess of the overall just trend of annual changes, mean changes. And 5 of the top 10 water levels recorded at the Fort Myers tide gauge were recorded in the past 3 years. And that's been, in place since 1965. So pretty long period of record and a very high concentration in just the past couple of years. Next slide, please. Okay, and now we'll move into the data collection and analysis section. So we've had water level data at the 2 weirs, so 1 in each basin, but we also installed 10 data loggers just across the island to get surface water data. And there were 14 in all. SCCF, which is another organization, installed 4 of them. And so we kind of they were installed post-hurricane though. So in 2024, we don't have long-term data for everywhere, but we have sort of big network now. Next slide, please. Thanks. We also looked at some groundwater monitoring data. What all the reports that we've read going all the way back to 1953 have said is that groundwater isn't typically a huge component of the water budget in terms of inflows and outflows. We don't see a lot of percolation out to the Gulf as far as we can tell. So we tended to focus a little more on surface waters. We were trying to figure out if there are any changes after the hurricane. Next slide, please. Okay, so on Sanibel, here we have the water budget. We took this from a 1970 report on Sanibel and 1970s, not 1970s. The vast majority of the inflow is from rainfall, as you would expect, because there's not really anywhere else for it to come from. And then almost all of the outflows come from evapotranspiration and open water evaporation. So you don't see a lot of runoff in general in your average year, and you don't see a lot of groundwater percolation. So because of that, like plant health and things like that are pretty important to the water, to the hydrology of Sanibel. Also on the left, this is also from the Sanibel report, and it kind of shows why we're trying to keep elevated freshwater levels in the interior, because there's this freshwater lens that prevents the saltwater from intruding into the groundwater. And so that's the reason. Next slide, please. Okay, so we wanted to see if there was, because residents seem to think that maybe something had changed in the hydrology, water levels were maybe higher post-Hurricane Ian. And so we're trying to figure out, okay, is there a difference, and if there is, why? So that's where we kind of got to NVDI, which is Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It's a way of monitoring plant health and density using multispectral imagery, like from a satellite. And the idea here was, you know, since like 70% of the outflow of water from Sanibel comes from evapotranspiration, obviously that is very related to plants. If the plants aren't healthy, or if they're dead, they're not going to be evapotranspirating. And so we wanted to see if we could find a correlation. But anyways, just intro to NVDI, I guess. The values range from -1 to +1. -1 is like the ocean, +1 would be a very healthy plant. And when we did it, generally I found that it seems that the images that we used seem to find that like the ocean and open water were about -0.3, roads had a value of about 0. The coastal mangrove areas that are saltwater on the northern end of Sanibel, those had a value of about 0.8, which is very high. And so did the interior wetlands. They ranged between 0.6 and 0.8. Also on the right here is like a picture that shows sort of an example of different NDVI values. So the tree on the left is green and healthy. It has a value of 0.7. And then the one on the right is either it's the fall and its leaves are turning or it's dying, and it has a value of an NDVI value of 0.1. So that's sort of a reference for what the different values kind of represent. Next slide, please. Okay, and so in order to be able to calculate NDVI, we needed images, so we decided to use Landsat images. Landsat images are publicly available. The satellites are from the US government, and there's been continuous monitoring of the world since 1972. We used data from the 2 most recent satellites, which were Landsat 8 and Landsat 9. Each of them takes a picture of Sanibel every 16 days, and now there's 2 of them, so we get a picture every 8 days. So we had a decent amount of pictures for our analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, so then once we got the satellite images and we got the data, we used the data to calculate NDVI. And one of the ways that we represented it is shown on the left by those blue dots, which show NDVI over time, an average of the NDVI of the interior basin shown in the map. And so obviously you see seasonal fluctuation each year. And then the other significant things are that huge drop after Hurricane Ian, caused by just stress on the plants, widespread death of them because of, wind, storm surge, and increased salinity. But after the hurricane, there was definitely progress towards recovery. And then we had Helene and Milton, which was another big surge event. And there's another drop, but it's not nearly as dramatic as the one after Ian. And if you see right at the very end of it, the vegetation is, shooting back to health very rapidly as compared to after Ian. So clearly the wetlands are pretty resilient. Another interesting thing, it's not called out on the graph like the other hurricanes are, but Hurricane Irma had almost no impact. When you're thinking of, major hurricanes that impacted the area, you can see a tiny little dip here, but nothing like these other events. Maybe because I don't think there's a lot of surge associated with Irma, but it's just an interesting observation. Also on the right is specific conductivity measurements at the location shown on the map with the star over time. And so before hurricane, and we have, values in the range between 0 and 15 millisiemens per centimeter. And then after the hurricane, it shoots up to even close to 40. But throughout 2023, it's going down. The freshwater is flushing it out. Then, of course, we have some more surge events, so it's back up. But our most recent one shown here is down at 20 millisiemens per centimeter. So hopefully with rainfall, we'll get the salinity back down to closer to fresh water to keep the plants healthy. Next slide, please. Okay, and another way that we visualize the NDVI results are these maps. So it's like pre and post Ian NDVI with blue is -1, white is 0, and green is +1. We also show like the averages over the whole thing. Or I think the averages are for the interior wetlands, they're from the earlier graph, but there's a big difference, obviously. And actually, could you go to the next slide, please? There you can see, so the average from 2013 to 2022, so pre-Ian is the first one, then we have 22 to 23, big drop, and then we see progress after 23 to 24, and then this current year, there is a difference after Milton and Helene, but it's not nearly as significant of a drop. And you mainly see the drop in the interior wetland areas as opposed to the more coastal mangrove ones, which would make sense if it has a lot to do with it being, or I guess it would make sense if it's because of the combination of surge and wind. There's less wind damage in Milton than in Ian, so the mangroves aren't impacted as much. They don't care if there's more salt water, but the interior wetlands do because they're typically fresh. Next slide, please. So we wanted to see if we could take that analysis of, clear changes in vegetation health and correlate that with water levels. So we found a study done in northern Florida on Hurricane Michael in 2018 of a watershed where the average NDVI dropped from 0.64 to 0.59. And because of that, they were able to find measurable reductions in ET and also increases in river flows. Obviously, the idea there being that there's less ET, so there's more of the water is entering the river because it's not going out via ET. So we wanted to see if we could find a similar relationship on Sanibel between our change in NDVI and water level decline rates, where we say, okay, there's not a whole lot of rainfall, and this time we'll try and find the slope of the line, see how quickly it's decreasing, and then say, okay, that's however many inches per day, and see how it compares before and after the hurricane. So we'll show that on the next slide. Actually not on the next slide. But first, we wanted to see, I guess, if will it even make a difference, whether there's any plants at all, and the water is just evaporating up from, open standing water versus there's, vegetation everywhere and it's going out via ET. And what we've found is that is pretty variable. So these are different plants, some in Florida, some in other places, and their ET rates as compared to shallow water evaporation rates. And basically it can be anywhere from 80% to 370% of shallow water evaporation rates. Depends on the plant and who measured it. Also, as a reference, reference ET is about 0.7 times shallow water evaporation, so it's less than shallow water evaporation, obviously. Next slide, please. So here we show reference ET, which is the amount of ET that you would expect from well-irrigated turf grass for each month. So because it varies over the months, highest in May. And what we would expect to see is that on Sanibel, we're going to have higher rates than that because there's going to be more water consumption by a wetland than by someone's lawn. And we'll actually show the pre and post stuff on the next slide. Okay, so we took data from Beach Road Weir, which is in the East Basin, shown up there. And the blue dots on here are water level decline rates before Ian, from 2019 to 2022 before the hurricane, and then the triangles are after Ian. And so there's definitely some variability. Because you can see, especially October, November, December there, we've got some of the triangles are way higher, huge decline rates, higher than before the hurricane, which isn't what we would expect. We would think there would be, slower decline rates because there are less plants. Those three are all from 2023. So it seems like maybe that's just an unusual time because in general, all the other ones tend to be less than all the other post measurements tend to be less than pre-Ian, and some of them are even less than reference ET, which you wouldn't expect because reference ET isn't particularly high in this case. And here on the right, we're showing some of the time periods that we used. So it's like, taking the slope of this line and then getting in inches per day and graphing it up. Next slide, please. So then this one's a little more complicated. Then we took, so the previous one, we have comparisons over time. This is more comparisons by location. We had all the 14, data loggers across the island. And so we have data from late 2024 through to early 2025. And we compared the decline rates across the island. We also do have the dots from the previous slide on there. So those yellow things you see are the pre-Ian decline rates at Beach Road Weir, and the crosses you see are the post-Ian. So you can still see that pre-post difference. But what's interesting is that in a lot of places, the current 2024 to 2025 decline rates in other locations across the island are quite similar to the ones at Beach Road Weir before Ian. There's a lot of variability here. And the other symbols are, we've got West Basin and East Basin. So one of the trends that we saw, or not a trend, I guess, but one of the things we can take away is that in general, the West Basin has higher ET rates than the East Basin. Probably because the West Basin tends to have a higher percentage of wetlands than the East Basin does. So that may have something to do with it, just more plants. And then we have what looks like a big outlier here, 0.81 inches per day. And it seems like you think, okay, maybe it's going over the Weir crest. Maybe there's something else going on, but actually it's the water level is below sea level at that point and just going down. So we found some unusual observations that is interesting, I guess. Next slide. Okay, so just to recap, we didn't find a super strong correlation between NDVI and the water level decline rates. If we had more data, we might be able to say, okay, those really high 2023 decline rates were just caused by something else. But it's hard to say with only, the amount of data that we had. And looking at the across the island ones now, they're pretty comparable to pre-Ian rates in a lot of places. So I guess the theory of why that is that when a bunch of vegetation dies, there's obviously less leaf cover. You're exposing more of the water to direct sunlight, and just that ends up increasing regular evaporation and decreasing the amount of ET. But as regular evaporation is going up, then that it may more than make up for it. But we did find one other interesting observation, so I'll show you that on the next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. Okay. This is water level data at the Beach Road area, where we took the water level decline rates from 2019 to current day, and we looked at the annual minimums. And what we found was from 2019 to 22, before Ian, we're seeing that in general, the minimum water level annually is about -0.5. And in the 3 years following that, the water level has not gotten as low. It's been up to 12 inches higher. We're not 100% sure why, but my theory is that maybe, like I said, just on the last slide, in general, when there's much standing water, the lack of vegetation is made up for by the direct sunlight helping with increased evaporation. But in times when we have really low water levels, like in the dry season, and it's probably below ground at that point, not having the roots in the ground kind of sucking up the water and transpirating it out is maybe what's making the difference here in terms of how low exactly it gets. Yeah, okay. Next slide, please. Okay, this is sort of the last section. We'll talk about resiliency, sea level rise, that kind of thing. So this chart.
Can I interrupt real quick?
Yeah.
Just one thing. The Sarasota Bay National Shore Program, the executive director gave a presentation to FS to the Florida Stormwater Association back in June. And he had a graph that looks like the one on the right, but it was air temperature trend over time. So I liked his idea, and so we converted that to water surface. So I don't know if anybody had seen his presentation. It may look similar to this one. But.
Yeah. It's for each month, for the period of record at the Fort Myers tide gauge, we have the maximum monthly tide. And then it's kind of, put in order or whatever. The redder ones are higher, the bluer ones are lower. And just looking at it, obviously you can see a huge trend. Almost all of the higher ones are on right here near the present day. And I mean, that's not really a surprise, but it's also interesting to see the recent surge events that have been obviously pretty significant. You see almost all your darkest ones are right here, just in the last few years. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, so sea level rise is obviously something to be concerned about when you're on a low-lying barrier island. So part of what we did is we took elevation points at all the public roads on Sanibel and figured out how many of them are at or below certain elevations. And what we found was that 95% of the roads are below 6 feet NAVD, 75% are below 5 feet, 30% below 4 feet. It's pretty low. And so we were looking at how can we deal with that going into the future. So next slide, please. Thanks. Oh yeah, first we compared it to other places just to see what it's like. or see how it compares. So we looked at 4 other barrier islands. So we looked at Key Biscayne, Miami Beach, and Marco Island. Sanibel's roads are in general higher than 3 out of the 4 of the other barrier islands, but we also looked at hurricane evacuation zone A for Fort Myers and for Naples, and that's just the hurricane evacuation zone A. It's not the whole city. You know, those are just way above still. So Sanibel is doing about as good or a little better than some of the other barrier islands, but still more vulnerable than mainland areas. And Jordan took a picture of this. That was funny. This is how Collier County is responding to sea level rise. They just say seawater on the pavement all the time. And next slide, please. This is sort of a complicated graph. There's a lot going on. It's maybe a little excessive, but it shows sea level rise projections for Sanibel. So we have intermediate low, intermediate, and intermediate high NOAA projections, as well as important elevations. So we have roadway elevations, and we have the Weir Crest elevations. So the we also have that blue line up near the top is the 2-year storm surge, which is about 3 feet. So what we're seeing is that, you know, as time goes on, let's assume it's offset from the intermediate high curve. So we're assuming, say, that's going to be the reality. In 2070, every 2 years, you're going to have a 3-foot storm surge, and 75% of your roads are going to be inundated, which is not ideal. So we sort of use this to come up with a recommended minimum roadway elevation going forward. So if you build any new roads, or, you know, also be good to raise some of them because they are quite low. We recommended that the minimum elevation be 4.3 feet NAVD, just based on the sea level from the intermediate high projection in 2070. We wanted to offset it. That's 2.3. We're recommending 4.3. We want to offset it 2 feet to make sure that the road base stays stable and doesn't erode away. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how sea level rise will impact surge events. So as you can see on the left, that's the 2-year storm surge of, again, that's plus 3 feet. That's the impact it has today. Very minimal flooding. You know, places where you see the water are already coastal mangrove areas mostly. But then, assuming the intermediate high projection, that same event will have a serious impact on the island. There will be significant and widespread inundation. So that's, yeah, storm surge impacts are probably going to get worse as sea level rise continues. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're just wrapping up here. Last slide. Some of the takeaways for the city, I think, were that it's going to be more difficult to keep the freshwater wetlands freshwater as time goes on and the sea level rises. They're looking at potential changes to the Weir Gate policy, whether or not they're going to open them and let water out. And they're thinking about trying to use pumping during the recovery from events. But yeah, next slide, please. Thank you for your time. If anyone has any questions, you can ask them. Yeah.
So I know that sea level rise is pushing our groundwater levels higher over time. So do you think that storm surge does the same thing on a micro event, like water sloshing in a bathtub, just staging the groundwater higher and then will eventually go back down, or that's just not the way things work?
I think we found in general the groundwater didn't change
Okay.
through the storms. Largely, I think here because it's so manipulated by the Weir. Like, there's the picture of the Weir, and there's gates on. The gates are huge. They're like 5 feet by 6 feet. There's two or four of them. So when those open, it drains the whole city in the course of like 12 hours. So because of that, but the only thing we really saw was that only in the months of maybe second half of April and May, it didn't quite get down as far in the past few years. But in general, we didn't see a lot of changes in groundwater.
Yeah, and also with surge events on Sanibel, it doesn't just come from the coast on Sanibel because we have that interior wetland system and the weirs. The weirs get overtopped by the surge event, so the surge, comes from the coast, but then it also comes inside the island and goes out that way, so.
Yeah.
First, I want to say great work and great presentation. This is a astoundingly great internship, in my opinion. And I wondered if you could review real quickly some of those important differences you found between the sort of water loss rates from open water versus lawn versus typical Sanibel wetland. What order were those in again?
It's sort of hard to tell, I guess, is what I would say. And that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I would say lawn probably should be at least lower than Sanibel wetland. Open water was, I think, open water is higher than lawn. And then I think in theory, Sanibel should be higher than open water, but all the, like that, thing where it showed all those different dots, some of those, where there's a dot here and a dot there and they're the same plant, different people measured them. It's hard to say. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I think you're
It's great, and I thought one of the implications of your study that we should think about as this group is what sort of rates of removal of water from the land to control flooding are we getting from things like dry detention areas that are managed as turf versus vegetated with natural vegetation or wet detention ponds. If we're concerned about freshwater flooding, what modes of managing our stormwater areas would put the water back in the sky the fastest. So that's something we need to get a handle on.
Yeah, and one thing that I think may be confounding, the NDVI and our water levels on Sanibel is that our weirs we manage the water levels artificially, so we discharge from the weirs. So it's not just that it rains and then it just sat, when we were looking at the NDVI without any manipulation, but we're manipulating the weirs, so that might be why you're not seeing, I expected to see the correlation with warm land, we didn't, but then when you think about it, we're discharging from the weirs to manage stormwater on Sanibel, so that might be why we're not really seeing that strong correlation between the NDVI and water levels.
Maybe it's better than to look at the literature reviews like what you presented on that slide for estimating what kind of rates you'll get from different land covers.
Yeah.
Stefan?
Just wanted to, excellent presentation, by the way. Just wanted to verify, so for the data that shows the storm surge and how that will affect the roadways throughout the island, you have considered a storm surge that would occur approximately 50% or every other year. So that's what a 2-year storm surge should be. Have you thought of any other scenarios potentially considering storm intensification in the future, or that's something that perhaps was not looked at? Just curious.
We didn't go into that, but
Yeah, part of the reason in the larger events, the whole island's inundated, so it's kind of like the roads are inundated now, and they're gonna keep being inundated. The bigger key takeaway from that, this was prepared first for city council so they can use it as a guide for planning, but like today like every other year storm event, the roads generally don't get inundated, but they're looking at, depending on which projection you look at. The intermediate high shows that 95% of roads will go under every other year, just for a couple of days. But yeah, I guess maybe that answers the question.
It does.
Dave?
So is it really even feasible to to raise all the roadways in Sanibel, or is that something that just people need to just get different vehicles or something?
Sure. So, I mean, it's a challenge, and some are easier to raise than others. If you just need to go up a couple inches, so that'd be another layer of asphalt would take care of it. And then there was a few that maybe need to go up by up to a foot. And there's different challenges in that. We want to make sure we don't, increase the shoulder width and impact the wetlands adjacent, or impact somebody's driveway slope up to their garage or something. But some of the roads we looked at would be rather simple to raise. But
I'm still thinking about people's their own personal, like you can raise the road up, but you can't necessarily raise the people's driveways up and all that. I'm just saying
That's the chief complaint we get about that, about flooding, when this happens, is that my driveway has flooded. But I mean, according to FEMA, you have not flooded, because that is your first floor of habitable living space is, or whatever your flood elevation, that's what is considered flooding. But we get complaints all the time about people's driveways flooding, and just, again, we're starting to have really hard conversations with people on Sanibel that this is going to be like the norm moving forward. That your driveway is going to have water sitting on it, but you're not flooded, but yeah.
trade in the Cadillac, get an F-150.
Yeah.
part of it, when the road base is saturated, you get more potholes and have not like corrugation issues. So then there's increased maintenance costs. But if the base, the aggregate underneath the asphalt, if that gets raised, then there's lower maintenance costs long term.
Jennifer, then Eric.
I only had a quick comment on that. Dr. John Stam of USGS has done some really amazing work crunching the ET data that they collect. And basically they come up with this whole term stomata resistance, which is basically this idea that he unveiled to us a couple of years ago, which kind of blew our minds, which is that the plants are adapting and constricting their stomata, and so are actually slowing the ET rate you would expect to rise with temperature rise, but it's not happening because the plants are actually adapting to try to hold the moisture more, and they're measuring that, and that may be one of the contributing factors to why the ET rates are not increasing at the rate you would have expected.
Yeah, that's true. When it goes into stress, it shuts down its lead, and then the actual ET would go down, even though reference ET would go up.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool.
Yeah, I guess my comment is related to that, not knowing anything about stomatal responses, but the trees themselves store water. And I just wondered if, if you knew more about the vegetative composition of the interior wetlands, rather than just the index, if you knew more about sizes of, I suppose you would get more insight maybe into the rate changes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it's a big island. There's several thousand acres of plants going on, different types of plants. Yeah, there's a lot of variability, and that's, I think, what we found most. But probably, especially in the second half of 23, when everything was getting fresher, everything was getting healthier, I think a lot of plants were filling back up. And so they were not only transpiring, but they were filling up new leaf growth.
Yeah. Cool.
Shout out to Gabby. She's super smart. It's her second internship. Yeah, she's one of the smartest people I've worked with. She actually learned Python in the course of like 2 days so that she could process all the imagery from the satellites. So that's pretty cool.
I have just one quick question. I have one quick question about the patterns of the NDVI and the plant stress. So it seems like most of the die-off of the plants happened initially, like just as soon as the surge hit.
Yeah.
Like there wasn't any kind of persistent effect on the fact that surface, the groundwater lens has changed, become more salty. There isn't like a long-term die-off. They sort of die quickly and then recover. Is that the results you were seeing?
Yeah, I think that's happening a little bit because there was like Ian, and then we had a nice kind of quiet period, and it was raining. So then a lot of plants are coming back. But then Debbie, Melvin, Helene, and I think a couple others in 24 really just like knocked a lot out. So I think there was a die-off of freshwater plants. Because now it's like ocean levels in parts of the interior freshwater wetlands, but
Well, and because it was such a major wind event, like every leaf on every tree was blown off. I mean, it looked, when you went out to the island, it looked like sepia tones. There was just like shades of brown. So yeah, that was like that really like dramatic hit. But then as Jordan mentioned, with some of the plants being exposed to this saltwater storm surge, there was like some that looked initially okay, but then began to die off, but that the wind event from Ian had a really dramatic effect, whereas Milton and Helene were surge events, but very minor wind events.
Interesting.
Okay.
That was really interesting and I learned a lot and I don't know anything about this. And my question's kind of more broad for people that know the modeling, but as sea level rises and you lose those habitats, does that impact how the water, like the ground level or the water is retained? Like, is that something that's taken into account for models as you're losing the habitat, the water may get higher? I don't know.
I think once the sea level rises enough and then it's permanently saltwater interior, the weirs are just pointless at that point, so they can be taken out, and then the whole interior, the whole ecosystem will have to change from freshwater plants to saltwater plants.
Yeah.
So there'd be a whole like change of
I think the whole system would change too. It would fluctuate probably more because you don't have the weirs holding water in. I assume whenever the tide goes down, everything goes down. So
That would be the baseline then.
I think it would definitely have an impact, I would think.
Thank you.
Okay. All questions? Thank you very much. Great presentation. Great study.